Whilst still on the process of a monohybrid cross, where we look at the inheritance of one characteristic, like right now, we are looking at the inheritance of height in pea plants, where a tall plant is crossed with a dwarf plant. And if you look at the genotype of the P1 parents, you can see that the tall plant is homozygous dominant, whereas the dwarf plant is homozygous recessive. And you can see that when the process of meiosis has occurred, each of the gametes formed will have one allele for height. So both of our male gametes are going to have the dominant allele, and both of our gametes for a dwarf plants are going to have a recessive allele. As a result, all the resulting F1 offspring are going to be heterozygous for height. And you can see in terms of the phenotype, all of our plants are going to be tall. This example illustrates what we call a complete dominance, because when we crossed a homozygous dominant plant with a homozygous recessive plant, all the resulting offspring expressed the characteristic controlled by the dominant allele. All our F1 offsprings were tall, although the offspring did contain the recessive allele, but the recessive allele was masked by the dominant allele. So we can say this example is showing us the law of dominance, which states that when a homozygous dominant parent is crossed with a homozygous recessive parent, all the F1 offspring will show the characteristic controlled by the dominant allele. And in our next example, we look at incomplete dominance. In our very first example, you can see that we are crossing a plant which has white flowers with a plant which has red flowers. And all the F1 offspring are showing an intermediate characteristic, which is pink. This means that although the white flower has a dominant alleles for white color, and although the red flower has dominant alleles for red flower, you can see in the phenotypes that one flower is white, the other flower is red. But because the allele for red flower is not dominant over the allele for white flower, also the allele for white flower is not dominant over the allele for red flower, so none of the alleles are dominant over the other. Hence, we have an offspring that is showing us an intermediate characteristic in terms of phenotype, which is pink. In our next example, again, you've got a red flower that is crossed with a blue flower. Again, the resulting offspring has an intermediate phenotype, which is purple, which means that the alleles for red flower is not dominant over the allele for blue flower. Hence, the intermediate characteristic is appearing in our F1 generation. So none of the alleles are dominant over the other, and we call this incomplete dominance. Then lastly, we have a situation where when a white flower is crossed with a red flower, the resulting offspring show both the phenotype of the parents. You can see this flower has white patches as well as red patches, which means that the allele for white color is equally dominant with the allele for red flower. Hence, the phenotype of both parents is appearing in the phenotype of the offspring. We call this one codominance. Again, here we've got a yellow flower that is crossed with a blue flower. The allele for yellow is dominant, but the allele for blue color is also dominant, which means that the alleles are equally dominant. And because both alleles are equally dominant, we've got a flower in the F1 generation that is showing the characteristic or the phenotype of both parents. We've got a flower that is blue as well as yellow. Now, it's important after having done this to also be able to do activities that are appearing in the worksheet that are dealing with the types of dominance. But you are given that worksheet, you can complete it, and then your teacher is going to give you feedback. Thank you.